In the theater of global hegemony, perception is often weaponized with greater efficacy than military hardware. For decades, the structural architecture of international relations has been defined by a relentless, quiet friction between the established superpower in Washington and the rising titan in Beijing. Every summit, every bilateral encounter, and every televised joint statement serves as a highly calibrated chess piece on a board that spans continents. But what happens when the carefully constructed illusion of supreme leverage shatters under the glare of international scrutiny? On May 15, 2026, the global balance of power witnessed a profound recalibration as the diplomatic delegations concluded their high-stakes summit in China. Observers worldwide began analyzing the fallout. The initial reports were stark. An American administration, long self-styled as fiercely hawkish and uncompromisingly protectionist, appeared to exit the negotiations largely empty-handed. To understand how the international community arrived at this critical juncture, one must look beyond the immediate headlines. This was not merely an isolated failure of statecraft. It was the culmination of converging global crises, with the United States simultaneously entangled in an escalating, ambiguous conflict in the Middle East, specifically facing severe strategic pressures regarding Iran. The strategic focus of Washington was visibly fractured. Beijing, sensing the split-screen vulnerability, executed a masterclass in diplomatic containment. This script deconstructs the structural anatomy of the summit, the internal contradictions of modern foreign policy, and the chilling geopolitical ripples now radiating across the Taiwan Strait. Great power diplomacy demands an unyielding adherence to national interest over personal affinity. Yet, the rhetorical strategy deployed during this pivotal trip left seasoned statecraft analysts profoundly bewildered. Instead of leveraging the economic or military might of the Western Hemisphere to extract concessions on intellectual property, market access, or regional security, the public messaging shifted entirely into an exercise in deep flattery. The leadership in Beijing was described in terms better suited for Hollywood film productions than grim geopolitical standoffs. Public statements gushed over physical stature, commanding presence, and an idealized image of an authoritarian leader emerging directly from central casting. While such rhetoric might be dismissed by some as eccentric political showmanship, the structural implications are devastatingly concrete. In international negotiations, unreciprocated praise from a global power signals an underlying lack of a coherent strategy. This flattery paradox is further complicated by public sentiment back home. Statistical data indicates that a mere 27% of the American public holds a favorable view of the Chinese state's authoritarian framework. By completely decoupling public rhetoric from the foundational anxieties of the domestic populace, a profound strategic vacuum was created. Beijing did not have to alter its stance or offer major concessions. It simply allowed the American delegation's own words to validate its domestic and international prestige. Perhaps the most unprecedented development of the 2026 summit occurred not behind closed doors, but across digital media channels. Historically, regardless of intense domestic political rivalries, American leaders maintained a unified front when standing on foreign soil, steadfastly defending the institutional resilience and moral authority of the United States. That norm was decisively shattered. In a series of public declarations, the American executive explicitly agreed with Chinese state propaganda regarding the structural decline of the United States. When the leadership in Beijing elegantly referred to America as a declining nation, the response from Washington was not a robust defense of Western economic power or democratic vitality. Instead, it was an endorsement. The administration claimed the assessment was 100% correct, choosing to view the statement through a hyper-partisan domestic lens, blaming previous administrations for tremendous damage, rather than identifying the comment as a calculated psychological operation by a systemic rival. For decades, Chinese state media has cultivated a narrative of inevitable American decay, pointing to partisan gridlock, social fragmentation, and economic volatility as evidence that the unipolar world order is ending. To have the sitting American president validate this exact talking point while standing inside the capital of its primary geopolitical competitor represents a stunning intelligence and diplomatic coup for Beijing. It signaled to the global community, and particularly to unaligned nations in the global south, that the leadership of the free world no longer possessed the ideological confidence to defend its own longevity. To fully comprehend the intellectual battlefield of this summit, one must grasp a concept deeply embedded in the strategic doctrine of both Washington and Beijing, the Thucydides trap. Coined by political scientist Graham Allison and rooted in the ancient history of the Peloponnesian War, this theory posits that when a rising power threatens to displace an existing hegemon, a structural stress is created that historically renders violent conflict nearly inevitable. During the summit, the Chinese leadership intentionally invoked this historical reference, warning of the catastrophic dangers of the Thucydides trap. It was a highly sophisticated rhetorical maneuver designed to frame the United States as an anxious, aggressive status quo power seeking to artificially suppress China's natural economic ascent. A well-prepared diplomatic team would counter this narrative by emphasizing collaborative frameworks, international law, and the defense of a rules-based order that allows all nations to prosper without coercion. Instead, the American response fell completely flat. Rather than neutralizing the trap, the administration absorbed the critique, redirected it inward to settle domestic political scores, and fundamentally missed the broader strategic trap being sprung. By failing to offer an alternative vision of enduring Western strength, the summit reinforced the dangerous perception that the United States is structurally retreating, leaving a vacuum that Beijing is more than willing to fill. While the public-facing statements were characterized by an asymmetry of flattery and concessions, the background reality regarding the world's most dangerous flashpoint was chillingly blunt. David Sanger of the New York Times noted a profound gap in posture, while the American side sounded remarkably conciliatory. The Chinese state was quietly, intensely confrontational, particularly on the status of Taiwan. The warnings delivered regarding the island were unequivocal. For Beijing, Taiwan is not a diplomatic bargaining chip. It is an absolute core interest, an unalterable objective tied to the historical legacy of the state. In past years, the United States maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, deliberately leaving it unclear whether a direct military intervention would occur in the event of an invasion. On multiple occasions, previous leadership had broken with that ambiguity to state explicitly that the U.S. would defend Taiwan, creating a potent deterrent. At this summit, that deterrence appeared to evaporate. The current administration's messaging signaled deep reluctance, openly questioning why the nation should risk conflict thousands of miles away. This shift in posture has sent shockwaves through Taipei. If the masterminds in the People's Liberation Army conclude that Washington lacks the political will to sustain a high-intensity conflict over Taiwan, the guardrails that have prevented a cross-strait war for nearly 8 decades may rapidly disintegrate. The global economy, which relies entirely on the advanced semiconductor infrastructure concentrated on that single island, now stands on an incredibly precarious edge. No summit occurs in an international vacuum. The primary reason the American delegation arrived in Beijing in such a profoundly compromised negotiating position was the unfolding disaster in the Middle East. The United States had recently launched an incredibly complex, ambiguous military campaign aimed at regime pressure, if not outright regime change in Iran. This conflict quickly exposed severe limitations in Western strategic capacity within a matter of months. High-intensity naval operations and missile defense deployments had depleted American precision. Did munitions stockpiles to dangerously low levels? Simultaneously, the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz sent global energy prices skyrocketing, dealing a severe blow to domestic markets. Beijing watched this unfolding entanglement with cold, calculating precision. While the United States poured its blood, treasure, and focus into a second-rate power in the Middle East, China quietly expanded its global diplomatic and economic footprint. By providing subtle economic lifelines to Iran and stepping in to alleviate supply chain shortages for neutral nations, China framed itself as a stable, adult actor on the world stage. The contrast was devastating. An exhausted, overextended superpower arriving in Beijing to ask for economic stability, while the rising power calmly dictated the terms of the encounter. When a superpower's grand strategy degenerates into late-night television satire, the loss of international prestige is swift. Following the summit, culture shapers and political commentators pointed out the profound intellectual asymmetry on display. While the leadership in Beijing communicated using classical historical frameworks and grand macroeconomic strategies, the American executive attempted to process complex geopolitics through bizarre, oversimplified analogies. In one highly scrutinized public address, the administration attempted to demonstrate an understanding of Sino-American relations by noting that Chinese restaurants in America outnumbered the 5 largest fast food chains combined. While intended perhaps as a light-hearted attempt at cultural connection, it was widely interpreted as an embarrassing display of intellectual unpreparedness. To reduce a vital relationship governing global stability, artificial intelligence standards, and nuclear deterrence to fast food metrics signals a catastrophic failure of leadership preparation. It exposed an administration completely unequipped for the rigorous, detail-oriented demands of high-stakes diplomacy. International allies watched in dismay as a summit that required the precision of a scalpel was approached with the nuance of a third-grade geography presentation. For political analysts, the most fascinating aspect of this diplomatic retreat is how completely it betrayed the administration's own domestic nationalist base. The political movement that carried the executive to power was built entirely on a foundation of absolute economic nationalism and fierce anti-China rhetoric. During the 2024 campaign cycle, explicit promises were made to safeguard American sovereignty. The base was told that Chinese nationals would be strictly banned from purchasing American farmland, ranchland, or real estate near sensitive military installations. It was a potent, highly charged narrative of national protection. Yet, during the summit interviews, that posture completely collapsed. When pressed on the issue, the executive reversed stance, arguing that cutting Chinese buyers out of the market would cause farm prices to drop and harm domestic landowners. Identical reversal occurred regarding educational visas. After years of framing Chinese students as potential state-sponsored intellectual property risks, the administration suddenly defended the presence of over 500,000 Chinese students in American universities, stating that banning them would be too insulting to Beijing. This sudden ideological pivot highlights a profound truth of modern populist politics. Aggressive rhetoric is easily deployed on the campaign trail, but when confronted by the cold reality of global economic interdependence, the populist facade often crumbles into total capitulation. In the arena of populist politics, the ultimate currency is the projection of raw, unyielding strength. Domestically, voters are often willing to overlook policy contradictions, personal controversies, and institutional norm-breaking if they believe their leader projects an aura of absolute dominance on the world stage. For this administration, that projection was its ultimate political superpower. But that superpower has now been fatally compromised. Political commentators across the spectrum have noted that the constant flattery, combined with a lack of tangible economic or strategic deliverables, has left the executive looking profoundly weak. When an American president stands before an authoritarian leader and constantly praises his physical attributes and absolute control, it does not look like dominance, it looks like submission. This perception of weakness is compounded by the undeniable physical realities of an executive approaching their 80th year. Signs of fatigue, public confusion, and an apparent lack of grasp on complex policy briefs have transformed the administration's image. From a fierce defender of national interest to an aging leader being actively outmaneuvered by highly disciplined foreign adversaries. Once a populist movement loses its ability to project strength, the entire ideological foundation begins to experience a rapid, irreversible decay. The true measure of a diplomatic summit is found not in the joint declarations that are signed, but in the tangible deliverables brought home. In standard international relations, every detail of a presidential visit is meticulously negotiated months in advance. Reporters are briefed on exactly what economic pacts, security treaties, or market agreements will be announced. The May 2026 summit yielded absolutely nothing. The sole attempt to claim a victory occurred when the administration boasted of securing a deal for China to purchase 200 Boeing commercial aircraft. But even this backfired disastrously. Wall Street analysts had already priced in an expectation of 400 to 500 jets when the lower figure was announced. Boeing stock immediately plummeted by 4%. More telling still was the reaction from Beijing, which responded to the claim with absolute, icy silence. This silence is the ultimate geopolitical insult. By refusing to even acknowledge or validate the minor deliverables claimed by Washington, Beijing sent an unmistakable message to the world. The United States is no longer viewed as an equal peer competitor whose domestic political anxieties must be managed. China allowed the American delegation to arrive, deliver praise, concede critical policy positions, and depart completely empty-handed. As the international community looks ahead to the remainder of 2026, the consequences of this summit will reverberate far beyond the halls of power. From the energy corridors of the Middle East to the highly volatile waters of the Taiwan Strait, the world has entered a deeply unstable era, one defined not by American strength, but by a visible, catastrophic vacuum of leadership.